The dust hung in the air like a curse that afternoon, thick and oppressive, clinging to every surface with the persistence of memory itself. It was the kind of dust that spoke of secrets buried too long, of earth that had been forced to hold too many lies. The sun, blood orange and weary, began its descent behind Ouagadougou's sprawling skyline, casting long shadows that seemed to reach into the very soul of the ancient city. The day's heat still radiated from the red earth, but there was something different in the air, an electricity, a sense that change was coming with the darkness. In the heart of the old quarter, where narrow streets wound through neighborhoods that remembered centuries of stories, Ibrahim Traoré walked with measured steps. His military boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each stride, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the urgent message that had brought him here. Behind him, a small group of his most trusted soldiers followed, their faces etched with curiosity and concern. They had seen their captain face many challenges, but there was something in his demeanor today that spoke of greater significance. The villagers who had summoned him waited in a tight cluster near the edge of what had once been a marketplace. Men with weathered faces stood beside women whose eyes held the deep wisdom of mothers and grandmothers. Children peeked from behind colorful fabrics, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and fascination. At the center of the group stood the village griot, an ancient man whose back was bent like a bow from decades of carrying the weight of oral history. His name was Amadou, and he had been the keeper of stories for longer than most could remember. Captain Traoré. Amadou's voice cracked with age and emotion as he approached. We called for you because this is not a matter for local authorities alone. What we have found, it concerns all of Africa. Ibrahim studied the old man's face, reading the lines of worry that seemed deeper than usual. Tell me, Elder, what has disturbed the peace of your community? Amadou gestured toward an area of disturbed earth about 50 meters away, where thorn bushes grew wild and untended. After the last rains, the flooding was severe. Waters ran through here like rivers, washing away soil that had remained undisturbed for generations. And when the waters receded, his voice trailed off, and he shook his head as if trying to dismiss a nightmare. What did you find? Ibrahim pressed gently. Something our fathers warned us never to disturb. Come, I will show you. But first you must understand there are stories, old stories, that speak of this place. My grandfather, may his soul rest in peace, told me that in his father's time, foreign soldiers came here. They brought machines, workers, materials. They dug deep into the earth and built something beneath our feet. And then, Amadou's voice dropped to a whisper. People began to disappear. The group walked slowly toward the disturbed area, the silence heavy with anticipation. Women clutched their children closer, and men fingered prayer beads with nervous energy. The soldiers checked their weapons instinctively, though they weren't sure what they might be preparing to face. As they approached the site, Ibrahim could see what had alarmed the villagers. Partially exposed by the recent flooding was a large slab of stone, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the fading light. The stone was clearly ancient, but the symbols were unlike anything from traditional African cultures. They were geometric, precise, almost mathematical in their design. These markings? Ibrahim knelt beside the slab, running his fingers over the carved surface. They're not mossy, not from any of our traditional scripts. No, Amadou confirmed, his voice heavy with foreboding. They are foreign marks, carved by foreign hands. But look closer, Captain. Look at what lies beneath. Ibrahim brushed away more of the accumulated dirt and debris. His breath caught in his throat as his fingers found cold metal embedded in the stone, a ring corroded with age but still intact. It was clearly a handle of some sort, suggesting that this was not merely a decorative stone, but a cover, a lid, a door, he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. A door that our ancestors sealed and swore never to open, Amadou replied. But the earth itself has chosen to reveal it. Perhaps it is time. Ibrahim looked up at the gathered villagers, seeing fear and hope warring in their faces. He thought of his mission as a leader of Burkina Faso, his commitment to uncovering the truth about Africa's relationship with its former colonizers. How many secrets lay buried beneath African soil? How many lies had been covered with earth? And time? Bring rope and tools, he commanded his soldiers. If this door has been revealed, then we will see what lies behind it. Two of his strongest men brought rope and iron bars from their vehicle. The metal ring was more corroded than it had first appeared, but after several attempts they managed to secure the rope and begin pulling. The stone groaned in protest, a sound like the earth itself crying out in pain. Dust and small rocks cascaded into the growing crack as the slab slowly shifted. The villagers stepped back as one, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers in local languages. Children began to cry, sensing the fear of their elders. Even the soldiers seemed unsettled as cold air began to seep from beneath the stone, carrying with it scents that didn't belong to the natural world above. With a final grinding sound that echoed across the old quarter, the stone slab shifted far enough to reveal what lay beneath. A stairway, narrow and constructed of fitted stones, spiraled down into absolute darkness. The steps glistened with moisture, and moss grew in patches along the walls. But most unsettling of all was the air that rose from below. It smelled of metal, chemicals, and something else, something that spoke of human presence and human suffering. Several women in the crowd screamed and fled, pulling their children with them. Others fell to their knees in prayer. The soldiers exchanged glances, their training warring with an instinctive fear of the unknown. Ibrahim stood at the edge of the opening, looking down into the darkness that seemed to swallow his flashlight, beam after only a few meters. He thought of all the stories he had heard throughout his life. Whispers of colonial experiments, rumors of medical trials conducted without consent, tales of Africans who had vanished without explanation. How much of what he had dismissed as folklore might actually be historical truth? "Captain," one of his soldiers spoke quietly, "perhaps we should return with more equipment, more men. This place, it feels wrong." Ibrahim turned to face his men and the remaining villagers. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of command, but also the weight of moral conviction. If we fear what lies beneath our own soil, then we remain slaves to those who buried it there. Africa has been wounded too deeply already by secrets and lies. We cannot heal what we refuse to examine. He turned back to the opening and began to descend, his flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead of him. "Stay close, but stay alert. Whatever we find down here, we face it as free, men seeking truth." The stairs seemed to descend much deeper than the simple stone covering had suggested. Each step echoed in the narrow space, and the air grew colder with each meter they descended. The walls were fitted stone for the first several meters, clearly, the work of skilled local craftsmen from an earlier era. But as they went deeper, the construction changed. The walls became smoother, more precisely cut, and eventually gave way to brick and mortar that was clearly of European design. "How far down does this go?" one soldier whispered, his voice carrying an edge of claustrophobia. Ibrahim paused to examine the walls more closely. "These bricks, they're not local. This construction is colonial era, probably French." He ran his hand along the mortar lines, noting their precision. This wasn't built quickly or cheaply. Someone invested significant resources in creating whatever lies below. The descent continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, Ibrahim's flashlight beam found the bottom, a narrow corridor that stretched away into the darkness in both directions. The walls here were lined with the same precise brickwork, but now there were other elements. Metal pipes running along the ceiling, electrical conduits, and small plaques mounted at intervals along the walls. As the soldiers reached the bottom and spread out to examine the corridor, Ibrahim focused his light on one of the plaques. His French was good enough to read the faded text, Zone de recherche A, accès restreint. Research Zone A, restricted access. Research, he said aloud, the word hanging heavy in the stale air. They called it research. The corridor branched in several directions, but one path was wider than the others, and it was along this route that they found the most ominous discovery yet. A steel door, clearly of 20th century manufacture, its surface marked with stenciled warnings in French. But it was the main text that made Ibrahim's blood run cold. Projet Afrique, ne pas ouvrir. Project Africa, do not open. The silence that followed this discovery was profound. Even the soldiers trained to face combat situations seemed frozen by the implications of what they had found. This was not some ancient burial chamber or forgotten storage area. This was something deliberately hidden, something that carried warnings against discovery. Ibrahim placed his hand flat against the cold steel and spoke words that seemed to come from some deep well of ancestral memory. You thought Africa would never find this, but tonight, we will. The steel door loomed before them like a gateway to hell itself, its surface scarred by decades of rust and corrosion, but still intact, still sealed. The French words stenciled across its surface seemed to mock them. Project Africa, do not open. As if Africa itself could be reduced to a project, an experiment to be conducted by foreign hands. Ibrahim examined the door more closely, running, his hands along its edges, searching for some mechanism of entry. His flashlight beam revealed hydraulic systems built into the frame. This was no simple door, but a complex sealing mechanism designed to keep something in, or more likely to keep someone out. Captain, whispered Sergeant Ouedraogo, one of Ibrahim's most trusted men. This construction, it's sophisticated, military grade. This wasn't built by archaeologists or historians. No, Ibrahim agreed, his voice grim. This was built by people who understood security, who knew the value of keeping secrets buried. He paused, studying the mechanism. But every lock can be opened. Every seal can be broken. We just need to find the key. They searched along the walls adjacent to the door, their flashlight beams probing every crevice and shadow. It was Corporal Sawadogo who found it. A rusted lever set into a recessed panel about 3 meters from the door. The lever was corroded almost beyond recognition, but the mechanical housing around it suggested it was connected to the door's sealing mechanism. This has to be it, Sawadogo said, gripping the lever with both hands. But Captain, are we sure we want to open this? The warnings... Ibrahim considered the question seriously. He thought of Amadou's stories, of the villagers who had disappeared, of the centuries of exploitation that Africa had endured. The warnings were written by those who created whatever lies behind this door. They were not written for our protection, but for theirs. Together, 3 soldiers gripped the lever and began to pull. The mechanism resisted, grinding and shrieking as decades of corrosion fought against their efforts. But slowly, inexorably, the lever moved. There was a deep mechanical rumble from within the walls, the sound of counterweights and hydraulics slowly coming to life. The steel door shuddered, then began to slide open with a grinding sound that echoed through the corridor like a death rattle. Cold air rushed out from the chamber beyond, carrying with it the scent of preservative chemicals, rust, and something else, something organic and wrong. As the door opened wide enough for them, To see inside, their flashlight beams revealed a corridor that was clearly not of African construction. The walls were smooth concrete, painted white but now stained and discolored with age. Fluorescent light fixtures hung from the ceiling, their bulbs long since burned out or broken. Most unsettling of all, there were signs mounted along the walls, all in French marking different areas: Laboratoire principal, Zone de confinement, Salle d'observation. Laboratory, Ibrahim translated quietly. Containment zone, observation room. He felt bile rise in his throat as the implications became clear. This isn't a storage facility or a bunker. This is a research complex. They entered the corridor, slowly, weapons ready, despite the obvious age of the facility. Their boots echoed on tile floors that had once been white, but were now stained with substances that didn't bear thinking about. The walls were lined with doors, some sealed, others slightly ajar, and through the gaps came glimpses of rooms filled with equipment that looked more suited to a hospital than to any legitimate research facility. Ibrahim pushed open the first door they encountered. Inside was a small room dominated by what appeared to be a dentist's chair, but one that had been modified with leather restraints and electronic monitoring equipment. Broken glass tubes littered the floor around the chair and on a rusted metal. Table nearby lay instruments that looked more like torture devices than medical tools. On the table was a clipboard with yellowed papers still attached. Ibrahim lifted the top sheet and began to read, his French allowing him to understand the clinical language that described procedures he wished he couldn't comprehend. Subject responses to electrical stimulation, tolerance levels for chemical agents, behavioral modifications through sleep deprivation. Jesus, Sergeant Ouedraogo breathed, looking over Ibrahim's shoulder at the documents. They were experimenting on people, on our people. Ibrahim's jaw clenched as he continued reading. Each page detailed procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics, every concept of human dignity. Subjects, never patients, always subjects, were identified only by numbers and basic demographic information. Age 14, female, Mossi ethnicity. Age 22, male, Fulani ethnicity. Age 31, female, Gourmandche ethnicity. They collected us like specimens, Ibrahim said, his voice tight with controlled rage. Categorized us by ethnicity, as if we were different species of animals. They moved deeper into the complex, discovering room after room of similar equipment. Some chambers contained what appeared to be sensory deprivation tanks. Others held devices that were clearly designed to induce pain or psychological trauma. In one room, they found walls lined with observation windows, behind which were small cells barely large enough for a human being to lie down. But it was in the central laboratory that they made the most horrific discovery of all. The room was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows above their flashlight beams. Along the walls stood rows of cylindrical tanks, each about 2 meters tall and filled with cloudy preservative fluid. Most were cracked or broken, their contents long since drained away, but several remained intact. And inside those tanks, suspended in the murky liquid like specimens in a museum, were human bodies. The soldiers recoiled in horror, several crossing themselves and whispering prayers. One young corporal turned away and vomited, the sound echoing through the chamber. Ibrahim forced himself to approach the nearest intact tank, his flashlight illuminating the figure within. It was a young woman, her body preserved in the chemical solution, her eyes closed as if in sleep. A metal tag hung from a chain around her neck. Sujet 34, terminé. Subject 34, terminated. Ibrahim moved from tank to tank, reading the tags, understanding with growing horror the scope of what had been done here. Dozens of human beings, all African, all reduced to numbered subjects in some monstrous experiment. The tags told a story of systematic brutality. Rejeté treatment, treatment rejected. Survie 8 mois, survived 8 months. Échantillon préservé, Sample preserved. "Captain," called Sawadogo from across the chamber, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." Ibrahim followed the corporal's voice to a bank of equipment that looked more modern than the rest of the facility. Computer monitors, though ancient, by current standards, sat dark and silent on metal desks. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and on the floor nearby lay scattered papers and photographs. Sawadogo held up a photograph, his hand trembling. It showed a group of people in white laboratory coats, standing in this very chamber, smiling for the camera as if they were at a company picnic. Behind them, clearly visible, were the tanks, with their human occupants. The photo was dated 1987, Ibrahim said quietly. This place was operational just 38 years ago. This isn't ancient history. This happened in our lifetime. They gathered more documents, more photographs, more evidence of the systematic dehumanization that had taken place in this buried facility. Research proposals written in dry academic language describing the need to understand African behavioral patterns for more effective governance. Progress reports detailing successful modifications to subject responses. Budget requests for additional specimens to be collected from rural villages. But it was a thick folder labeled Projet Afrique, Report Final, that contained the most damning evidence. Ibrahim opened it with trembling hands and began to read the executive summary, translating for his men as he went. Project Africa was initiated in 1962 with the objective of developing more effective methods for managing post-colonial African populations, he read. Through systematic study of psychological, physical, and social responses to various stimuli, the project aimed to identify optimal approaches for maintaining stability and economic productivity in former French territories. The clinical language couldn't disguise the truth. This had been a program designed to find better ways to control African people, to keep them subjugated and compliant. The research had involved kidnapping people from villages, subjecting them to psychological torture, medical experimentation, and ultimately murder. "They stole our people," Sergeant Ouedraogo said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They brought them here and they tried to find ways to break us, to make us easier to control." Ibrahim closed the folder and looked around the chamber at the evidence of decades of atrocities. And when they were finished, they sealed it all away and pretended it never happened, left our people in these tanks like trophies. Suddenly, from somewhere in the depths of the facility, they heard a sound that made their blood freeze, a low, mechanical humming, faint but unmistakably electronic. The soldiers spun around, weapons raised, flashlights cutting through the shadows. "That's impossible," Sawadogo whispered. "This place has been sealed for decades. There can't be power." But even as he spoke, lights began to flicker along the walls of the laboratory. Not the harsh fluorescent lighting they had seen fixtures for, but a dim red emergency illumination that cast everything in the color of blood. The humming grew louder, and now they could hear other sounds. The whir of motors, the hiss of hydraulics, the mechanical breathing of a facility coming to life. Backup power, Ibrahim realized. The place has been in some kind of standby mode. Our presence must have triggered automated systems. As if in response to his words, screens along the walls began to flicker to life, displaying text in French that scrolled past too quickly to read completely. But Ibrahim caught enough to understand the gist. Intrusion détectée. Protocole de sécurité activé. Transmission en cours. Intrusion detected, he translated. Security protocol activated. Transmission in progress. His blood ran cold. It's sending a signal. Somewhere, someone is being notified that we're here. The implications hit them all simultaneously. This facility might be abandoned, but it was still connected to something, still reporting to some authority. And that authority would not want witnesses to what had been discovered here. But before they could fully process this threat, they heard something that drove all other concerns from their minds. From one of the intact tanks came a soft tapping sound, as if someone were knocking on glass from the inside. All eyes turned toward the sound. In one of the tanks they hadn't yet examined closely, the preservative fluid was beginning to clear, and inside, a pair of eyes had opened. Human eyes, yellow and unfocused but undeniably alive. The figure in the tank was moving, pressing a hand. Against the glass, bubbles rising around its face as it appeared to be trying to speak. The soldiers raised their weapons instinctively, but Ibrahim held up a hand to stop them. "Don't shoot," he commanded. "If someone is alive in there, they're a victim, not a threat." The tank began to vibrate, fluid sloshing as the figure inside became more agitated. Cracks appeared in the glass, spreading like spider webs from the point where the person was pressing against the interior. With a sound like breaking crystal, the tank shattered, sending preservative fluid cascading across. The laboratory floor. The figure inside collapsed forward, gasping and choking as it breathed air for what might have been the first time in decades. Ibrahim rushed forward to help, supporting the person as they struggled to stand. It was an elderly man, his skin pale. From years of chemical preservation, his hair white and floating like seaweed. His eyes, though yellow and strange, held intelligence and awareness. "Please," the man whispered in French-accented Moray, his voice like rustling leaves. "Please, tell me, what year is it?" "It's 2024, Ibrahim replied gently, supporting the man's weight. The survivor's eyes widened in horror. "Mon Dieu, 37 years. They kept me here for 37 years. As he spoke, more lights flickered on throughout the facility, and the humming of machinery grew louder. On the screens around the laboratory, text continued to scroll, but now images began to appear as well. Grainy surveillance footage that seemed to be transmitting their location and activities to some remote destination. "Captain," Sergeant Ouedraogo called urgently, "we need to leave. Now. If this place is reporting our presence—" But the survivor gripped Ibrahim's arm with surprising strength. "No," he said, his voice gaining power as he spoke. "Not yet. You must destroy the heart of this place. The central computer, the generator that powers it all. As long as it exists, they can rebuild. They can return." Ibrahim looked into the man's eyes and saw decades of suffering, but also a fierce determination for justice. "Where?" he asked simply. The survivor pointed toward a corridor they hadn't yet explored, one that led deeper into the facility. "Down there, the power core, the master computer. Everything is controlled from there, but be warned, they built automated defenses. If the facility is threatened, it will try to protect itself." As if summoned by his words, alarms began to wail throughout the complex, and red lights flashed in rhythm with the piercing sound. The mechanical humming rose to a roar, and somewhere, in the distance, they could hear the grinding of heavy machinery. "Containment protocol activated," came a synthesized voice from hidden speakers, speaking in French. "Facility lockdown in progress. All unauthorized personnel will be contained for processing." The steel door through which they had entered began to slide shut, moved by the same hydraulic systems that had allowed them to open it. They were being trapped inside the very facility they had come to investigate. Ibrahim made a decision that would define not just his own fate, but the future of everyone who would ever learn about this place. "Sergeant, take half the men and get our survivor to safety. Force that door if you have to. The rest of us are going to finish what we started." "Captain, you can't—" "That's an order," Ibrahim cut him off. "This place is an abomination, a wound. In the heart of Africa that has been festering for decades, it ends tonight." As his men moved to carry out his orders, Ibrahim turned to the survivor. "What's your name, brother?" The old man straightened, dignity returning to his bearing despite his circumstances. "My name is Kofi Asante. I was taken from my village in 1987. I was a teacher before they brought me here." "Well, Teacher Asante," Ibrahim said, helping the man toward the corridor that led deeper into the facility. "Tonight we're going to teach them that Africa cannot be buried." The corridor that led to the facility's power core stretched before them like the throat of some mechanical beast, lined with pipes and cables that pulsed with energy. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the wailing. Alarms made communication difficult, but Ibrahim pressed forward, supporting Kofi Asante while his remaining soldiers followed, their weapons ready for whatever automated defenses they might encounter. The deeper they went, the more sophisticated the facility became. What had started as a crude underground laboratory was revealing itself to be something far more complex. A research installation that had been built with military precision and funded with serious resources. The walls here were reinforced concrete. The floors were metal grating, and ventilation systems hummed overhead with the efficiency of advanced engineering. "This place!" Ibrahim shouted over the alarms. "It's bigger than we thought. This isn't just some colonial experiment. This is a major installation." Kofi nodded grimly. "Project Africa was much larger than what you've seen so far. This was just one node in a network that stretched across French colonial territories. But this was the central facility, the place where they coordinated everything. They passed through several security checkpoints, each one triggering additional alarms and warnings. The synthesized voice continued its announcements. "Unauthorized personnel detected in Sector C, containment teams activated, facility sterilization. Protocol standing by." "Containment teams?" Corporal Sawadogo asked, checking his rifle nervously. "What containment teams? This place has been abandoned for decades." But even as he spoke, they heard the mechanical whirring of motors and the metallic clank of machinery moving through the corridors behind them. Ibrahim risked a glance back and saw robotic sentries emerging from hidden panels, crude but functional. Machines armed with what appeared to be tranquilizer weapons. "Automated security," Kofi explained, breathing heavily from the exertion of walking. "They never trusted human guards with the deepest secrets. These machines were programmed to contain or neutralize any threats to the facility." The robots moved, with mechanical precision, their sensors sweeping the corridor as they advanced. Ibrahim realized that they couldn't outrun the machines while supporting Kofi, and there was nowhere to take cover in the narrow passageway. "Sir," Sergeant Ouedraogo called from behind them. "They're closing in. We need to make a stand." "No," Ibrahim decided quickly. "We keep moving. Our mission is the power core, not fighting robots." He turned to address his men while still supporting. "Kofi, suppressing fire only. Don't try to destroy them. Just slow them down long enough for us to reach our objective." The soldiers opened fire, their bullets sparking off the robots' armored casings. The machines weren't heavily protected, but they were persistent, continuing their advance even after taking multiple hits. However, the gunfire did slow them down, forcing them to pause and recalibrate their targeting systems with each impact. "There." Kofi pointed ahead to where the corridor opened into a vast chamber. "The heart of the facility. Everything is controlled from there." They burst through the entrance into a room that took Ibrahim's breath away. It was enormous, easily the size of an airplane hangar, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows. High above, the space was dominated by a massive computer system that filled the center of the room. Banks of processors, memory units, and control panels that stretched from floor to ceiling. Cables as thick as tree trunks ran from the computer core to various points around the chamber, and the air thrummed with electrical power. But it wasn't just the size of the installation that shocked Ibrahim. It was the evidence of how recently it had been active. Workstations around the perimeter of the room showed signs of recent use. Coffee cups sat half-empty on desks. Papers were scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. Most unsettling of all, several computer screens were still active, displaying what appeared to be surveillance footage from locations across West Africa. "This place," Ibrahim said slowly. "It's not abandoned at all, is it?" Kofi shook his head grimly. "Project Africa never ended. It just went underground. They've been monitoring, collecting data, probably still conducting experiments. Just more carefully, more secretly than before. On one of the active screens, Ibrahim could see footage of what appeared to be a medical clinic in a rural village. Doctors in white coats were administering injections to children while their parents watched trustingly. The timestamp on the footage showed it had been recorded just days ago. "They're still doing it," he whispered, his voice filled with horror and rage. "They're still experimenting on our people." He moved to another workstation where files were open on the screen. His French was good enough to understand the clinical language. Ongoing studies in behavioral modification, pharmaceutical trials conducted without informed consent, psychological profiling of population groups across multiple African nations. "Destroy it," he said quietly, then louder. "Destroy it all!" His soldiers immediately began setting charges around the massive computer core, but Kofi grabbed Ibrahim's arm urgently. "Wait," the old teacher said. "First, we need to copy the files, the evidence. Without proof of what they've done, the world will never believe it. They'll call it conspiracy theories, propaganda." Ibrahim saw the wisdom in this, but the sound of approaching robots was getting louder. They had perhaps minutes before the automated security reached them. "Can you operate these systems?" he asked Kofi. "I learned during my years of captivity," Kofi replied, moving to a central terminal with surprising agility. "They used some of us as technical assistants when our minds were compliant enough." His fingers flew over the keyboard, accessing files and databases with the skill of someone who had been forced to become intimately familiar with the system. Screen after screen of data flashed past. Experimental protocols, subject databases, financial records, correspondence with government officials and pharmaceutical companies. "Mon Dieu," Kofi breathed as he accessed a file labeled Projet Afrique, Sites Actifs. "Look at this. Active sites across 17 African countries. They're everywhere." The screen showed a map of Africa with dozens of red dots marking active facilities. Each dot, when clicked, revealed details about ongoing operations, medical research stations, psychological studies, social engineering projects. The scope of it was breathtaking and horrifying. "They never stopped," Ibrahim said, studying the map. "They just got better at hiding it." Behind them, the sounds of the approaching robots grew louder, accompanied now by new mechanical noises, the whir of weapons systems powering up, the hiss of hydraulics preparing to deploy more serious defensive measures. "I'm copying everything to portable drives," Kofi said, his hands never stopping their work. "But it will take a few minutes to transfer all the critical files." "We don't have a few minutes," Sergeant Wedrogo reported from the chamber entrance. "The robots are almost here, and they're bringing friends. Looks like the facility has more than just tranquilizer weapons in its arsenal." Ibrahim made another command decision. "Set up defensive positions around the computer core. We hold this room until Kofi finishes the download, then we blow everything and get out." The soldiers took cover behind workstations and equipment racks, creating a perimeter around the central computer system. Just as they finished positioning themselves, the first robots entered the chamber, followed by larger, more heavily armed units that looked capable of delivering lethal force. "Warning," the synthesized voice announced throughout the facility. "Unauthorized data access detected. Initiating terminal security protocols. Lethal force authorized." The battle that followed was unlike anything Ibrahim had experienced in his military career. These weren't human opponents driven by ideology or desperation. These were machines programmed with single-minded determination to protect the facility's secrets. They advanced with mechanical precision, their weapons firing with algorithmic accuracy, showing no fear or hesitation. But Ibrahim's soldiers were fighting for something more than just survival. They were fighting for the truth, for justice, for the memory of all the people who had suffered and died in this place. Their shots were guided by righteous anger, and their tactics were informed by human creativity that no computer program could anticipate. Transfer at 60%, Kofi called out over the gunfire. Keep them back just a little longer. A larger robot, equipped with what appeared to be a flamethrower, advanced toward their position. Ibrahim realized that the scattered papers and electronic equipment around them would create a fire hazard that could destroy everything they were trying to preserve. "Focus fire on the big one," he ordered. "Don't let it use that weapon." The concentrated fire from his soldiers managed to damage the robot's weapon system before it could deploy flames, but more machines were entering the chamber, and their defensive positions were being steadily compressed toward the center of the room. 80%, Kofi announced. A new sound joined the cacophony of battle, the whine of jet engines spinning up. Through openings in the ceiling high above, Ibrahim could see military aircraft circling the facility's location. Whoever was receiving the facility's transmissions had dispatched a response team. "They're coming," he told his men. "Whatever happens here, the world needs to know what we've found. These files must reach the outside world." 95%, Kofi called. "Almost there." The robots had succeeded in flanking their position, forcing the soldiers to form a tighter defensive circle around the computer core. Ammunition was running low, and several of his men had been wounded by the machine's increasingly accurate fire. "Done!" Kofi shouted triumphantly, pulling multiple storage devices from the computer terminal. "I have everything! The complete database, all the evidence, every file." "Then we finish this," Ibrahim declared. He turned to his demolitions expert. "Blow the core. Bring this whole chamber down if you have to." But before the charges could be detonated, a new voice echoed through the chamber. Not the synthesized announcements they had been hearing, but a human voice speaking accented English over the facility's communication system. "This is Colonel Marcel Dubois, speaking for the Joint Franco-African Research Initiative. You are trespassing on an international medical facility. Cease your destructive activities immediately and surrender for processing." Ibrahim picked up a radio handset from one of the workstations and keyed the transmit button. "This is Captain Ibrahim Traoré of the Burkina Faso National Army. I am standing in a chamber full of evidence of crimes against humanity. The only processing that will happen tonight is the processing of war criminals." There was a pause. Then Dubois' voice returned, harder and more threatening. "Captain Traoré, you are interfering with legitimate research that benefits all of Africa. The subjects you have discovered volunteered for these programs. You are destroying decades of medical advancement that could save millions of lives." Ibrahim's laugh was bitter and filled with rage. "Volunteered? I'm looking at tanks full of murdered Africans, at children who were kidnapped from their villages, at decades of torture disguised as science. There is no legitimacy here, only evil. The greater good sometimes requires difficult sacrifices," Dubois replied coldly. "You lack the education to understand the complexities of what we accomplish here. Stand down, Captain, and we can discuss this rationally. The only discussion we need," Ibrahim shot back, "is the one we'll have in an international court when the world sees what you've done." Kofi had finished securing the data drives and was moving toward Ibrahim's position. "Captain," he said urgently, "we need to leave now. The facility has a self-destruct protocol. If they can't contain us, they'll destroy everything, including us, to protect their secrets." As if summoned by his words, red lights began flashing even more urgently throughout the chamber, and a new alarm began to sound, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the facility. "Self-destruct sequence initiated," the synthesized voice announced. "All personnel evacuate immediately. Detonation in 10 minutes." The robots immediately ceased their attack and began retreating toward the chamber exits, their programming apparently prioritizing their own preservation over the elimination of intruders. Ibrahim's soldiers looked at him expectantly, waiting. "For orders." "Sir," Sergeant Ouedraogo called out, "we need to go, now." But Ibrahim looked around the chamber one more time, at the massive computer system that had coordinated decades of atrocities, at the evidence of ongoing crimes against humanity, at the proof that Project Africa had never truly ended. In 10 minutes, all of this would be destroyed, and with it, much of the physical evidence of what had been done here. "Kofi," he said to the survivor, "you have the files. Everything we need to expose this?" The old teacher nodded, clutching the storage. Devices protectively. Everything. Financial records, correspondence with government officials, detailed documentation of every experiment, every victim. Enough evidence to bring down the entire network. "Then we go," Ibrahim decided. But first, he turned to his demolitions expert. "Can you accelerate their countdown?" The soldier grinned grimly. "My charges will go off in 3 minutes instead of 10. But Captain, that doesn't give us much time to escape." "Do it," Ibrahim ordered. "If this place is going to be destroyed anyway, let's make sure it's destroyed on our terms, not theirs." The Die team began fighting their way back toward the chamber exit, but the facility's self-destruct sequence had triggered additional automated defenses. Blast doors were sealing corridors, emergency lockdowns were activating throughout the complex, and gas began venting from ceiling fixtures. Not lethal, but designed to disorient and slow down anyone trying to escape. "This way," Kofi called. Out, his knowledge of the facility's layout proving invaluable. "There's an emergency exit that leads to the old tunnel system. It connects to the surface through a different route than the one we used to enter." They fought their way through corridors filling with smoke and gas, past laboratories and holding cells that told the story of decades of human suffering. In one room, Ibrahim glimpsed walls covered with photographs, hundreds of faces, all African, all marked with numbers and clinical notations. Victims whose names might never be known, whose families might never learn their fate. 2 minutes to detonation, the facility's voice announced, though it was now distorted by damage to the speaker systems. They reached the emergency exit just as the lights throughout the facility began to fail. Kofi worked frantically at a manual override system while the soldiers provided security, and Ibrahim tried to calculate whether they had enough time to reach safety. "Got it," Kofi announced as the heavy door began to grind open. Beyond lay a narrow tunnel that led upward at a steep angle, carved from natural rock rather than constructed with bricks and mortar. "This leads to an old mining shaft about half a kilometer from where we entered," Kofi explained as they began to run up the tunnel. It was how they brought in sensitive materials without being seen. Behind them, the sounds of the dying facility grew louder, systems failing, structures collapsing, the mechanical death throes of a complex that had hidden terrible secrets for far too long. And then, with a sound like the earth itself screaming, their charges detonated, followed seconds later by the facility's own self-destruct explosives. The tunnel shook violently and chunks of rock rained down from the ceiling. The blast wave, from below, lifted them off their feet and threw them forward. But the tunnel held, its natural construction proving more durable than the artificial structures below. They emerged from the mining shaft into the cool night air just as a series of explosions erupted from the ground behind them. The earth itself seemed to heave and crack, and flames shot up from fissures that opened in the soil. For several minutes, the very ground shook as the massive underground facility collapsed in on itself, taking with it decades of evidence. But not all of it. Not the evidence they carried with them. The explosions could be heard across Ouagadougou, and by the time Ibrahim and his team reached the city, crowds had already gathered in the streets, drawn by the sounds and the glow on the horizon. News traveled fast in the digital age, and videos of the mysterious blasts were already appearing on social media, accompanied by wild speculation about what had caused them. But Ibrahim had more important concerns than managing public curiosity. Kofi Asante, the survivor they had rescued, was growing weaker by the hour. Decades of chemical preservation had left his body in a precarious state, and he needed immediate medical attention. More importantly, the data drives containing evidence of Project Africa's crimes needed to be copied and distributed before anyone could move to suppress them. They made their way to a safe house that Ibrahim maintained for sensitive operations. A modest building in an older part of the city where the neighbors minded their own business and asked few questions. There, with Kofi resting under medical supervision, Ibrahim began the process of examining what they had recovered from the facility. The scope of the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showing funding from multiple European governments and pharmaceutical companies. Correspondence between facility directors and officials in Paris, Brussels, and Washington discussing population management strategies and behavioral modification programs. Detailed experimental protocols that read like something from the darkest chapters of human history. But perhaps most damning were the current operational files, evidence that Project Africa had never ended, but had simply evolved. The map they had seen showing active sites across 17 African countries was just the beginning. There were research stations disguised as medical clinics, psychological studies conducted through educational programs, and pharmaceutical trials that used African populations as unwitting test subjects. This isn't just historical, Ibrahim said to Sergeant Ouedraogo as they reviewed the files. This is happening now. Right now, today, there are facilities across Africa conducting unauthorized experiments on our people. Kofi, despite his weakness, insisted on helping to organize and explain the evidence. His decades of forced familiarity with the system made him an invaluable guide through the complex documentation. The project evolved after the colonial period, he explained, his voice still hoarse from his long captivity. They couldn't operate as openly as they had before, so they developed more subtle methods, medical aid programs that were actually research studies, educational initiatives that were psychological experiments, economic development projects that were social engineering trials. As they worked through the night, copying files and preparing documentation, Ibrahim began to understand the true scope of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just about the one facility they had discovered. It was about a systematic, ongoing program of exploitation that had been operating for decades under the cover of humanitarian aid and development assistance. But he also understood that simply having the evidence wouldn't be enough. The same forces that had operated this program for so long would move quickly to discredit any revelations, to dismiss them as conspiracy theories or anti-Western propaganda. They needed to present the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored or suppressed. "We need allies," Ibrahim told his men. "Journalists, human rights organizations, government officials who can't be bought or intimidated. We need to get this information to people who have the credibility and resources to act on it." By dawn, they had compiled a comprehensive dossier of evidence and begun the process of distributing it to contacts across Africa and around the world. Copies went to investigative journalists at major international news organizations, to human rights lawyers at the United Nations, to medical ethics boards, and to government officials in every African nation that appeared on the facility's target list. But Ibrahim knew that the most important audience for this information was the people of Africa themselves. They were the ones who had suffered, the ones who deserved to know the truth, the ones who would ultimately demand justice. He arranged for Kofi to give a televised interview on Burkina Faso's national television network, despite the old teacher's weak condition. The image of the frail survivor, still bearing the physical marks of his decades of captivity, speaking calmly and clearly about what had been done to him and countless others, was more powerful than any amount of documentation could be. "They told me I was participating in medical research that would help my people," Kofi said during the interview, his yellow eyes looking directly into the camera. "They said the injections, the psychological tests, the isolation, all of it was for the greater good. It took me years to understand that I wasn't a patient. I was a laboratory animal." The interview aired simultaneously on networks across West Africa, and within hours it had been shared millions of times on social media platforms. The images of the destroyed facility, the documentation of ongoing experiments, and most of all Kofi's testimony, created a firestorm of outrage that spread across the continent and around the world. In villages across Africa, people began to questioned medical programs they had never suspected. In cities, students organized protests demanding investigations of foreign-funded research projects. In government offices, officials found themselves under pressure to explain their relationships with organizations that appeared on Project Africa's funding lists. But the response wasn't limited to Africa. In Europe and North America, the revelations sparked investigations by parliamentary committees and congressional panels. Pharmaceutical companies found themselves facing lawsuits and regulatory investigations. Academic institutions were forced to review their research partnerships and funding sources. The evidence Ibrahim had recovered was too comprehensive, too well documented, and too widely distributed to be suppressed or dismissed. It painted a picture of systematic exploitation that spanned decades and continued into the present day. 3 months after the destruction of the underground facility, Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, flanked by Kofi Asante and a team of international human rights lawyers. The session was being broadcast live around the world, and the chamber was packed with journalists, diplomats, and observers from across the globe. The intervening months had seen a cascade of revelations and investigations triggered by the evidence they had uncovered. Parliamentary inquiries in France and Belgium had revealed government knowledge of and complicity in Project Africa's activities. Pharmaceutical executives had been arrested in multiple countries. Academic institutions had been forced to acknowledge their participation in unethical research. Most importantly, the active sites identified in the facility's files had been investigated and shut down. In village after village across Africa, people had learned that medical programs they had trusted were actually unauthorized research studies. Children who had been given experimental vaccines as part of humanitarian aid programs were finally receiving proper medical care. But for Ibrahim, the most significant development had been the response of African governments and people themselves. The revelations had sparked a continent-wide movement demanding accountability not just from foreign powers, but from African leaders who had allowed or enabled these programs to operate on their soil. The evidence we present today, Ibrahim told the Human Rights Council, documents not just historical crimes, but ongoing violations of human dignity that continued until very recently. The people of Africa were treated not as human beings deserving of respect and care, but as subjects for experimentation, as laboratory animals whose suffering was justified by claims of scientific advancement. He gestured toward Kofi, who sat quietly beside him, still bearing the physical effects of his decades of captivity, but radiating a dignity that no amount of abuse had been able to destroy. "This man," Ibrahim continued, "was stolen from his village as a young teacher and kept in chemical suspension for 37 years while researchers studied the effects of various compounds on his body and mind. He is not unique. The evidence shows that hundreds, possibly thousands of Africans suffered similar fates." The French representative to the council, clearly uncomfortable, rose to respond. "While we acknowledge that historical research programs may not have met current ethical standards, it's important to remember the context of the times and the genuine scientific advances that resulted from this work. Many of the medical treatments that save lives today were developed through research conducted during this period." Ibrahim's response was swift and uncompromising. "No medical advance justifies the systematic dehumanization of an entire population. No scientific discovery is worth the lives of the people who were murdered in the name of research. And most importantly, this was not historical research. It was ongoing until we exposed it." The evidence presentations continued for days, with witness after witness testifying about their experiences with programs that had claimed to provide medical aid but were actually conducting unauthorized research. Doctors testified about being pressured to administer experimental treatments without informing patients. Government officials admitted to receiving payments for allowing foreign research programs to operate without proper oversight. Perhaps most powerfully, other survivors came forward. The destruction of the main facility had been followed by investigations. of other sites, and more people who had been subjected to unauthorized experimentation were discovered and rescued. Their testimonies, combined with the documentary evidence Ibrahim had recovered, painted an undeniable picture of systematic abuse. But the hearings also revealed the extent to which these programs had been integrated into legitimate aid and development work. Pharmaceutical companies had used African populations to test new drugs without proper consent. Universities had conducted psychological studies under the guise of educational programs. Even some genuine humanitarian organizations had been unknowingly used as cover for research activities. The complexity of untangling legitimate aid from exploitative research became one of the most challenging aspects of the post-revelation period. How could African communities accept needed medical assistance while ensuring they weren't being subjected to unauthorized experimentation? How could researchers conduct ethical studies in resource-limited settings without replicating the abuses of the past? These questions didn't have easy answers, but Ibrahim argued that the solution had to begin with transparency and genuine consent. The people of Africa are not incapable of making informed decisions about medical research, he told the council. What we lacked was information. We were lied to, manipulated, and deceived. Give us the truth, treat us as equal partners rather than subjects, and we can work together toward genuine medical advancement. 1 year after the discovery of the underground facility, Ibrahim stood once again in the old quarter of Ouagadougou, but the scene was dramatically different. Where once there had been a hidden entrance to a chamber of horrors, there was now a memorial garden. The space was marked with simple stone monuments bearing the names of victims who had been identified from the facility's records, and a larger monument to the thousands whose names might never be known. Kofi Asante, despite his age and the trauma he had endured, had become something of an international figure, traveling the world to speak about his experiences and advocate for stronger protections against medical abuse. His testimony had been instrumental in the establishment of new international protocols for medical research, particularly in developing nations. The political ramifications of the Project Africa revelations continued to unfold. Several European governments had fallen as a result of their involvement in or tolerance of the programs. New international treaties had been signed establishing stronger oversight of medical research across national borders. Most significantly, a new generation of African leaders had emerged, committed to ensuring that such exploitation could never happen again. But perhaps the most important change was in the consciousness of African people themselves. The revelations had shattered the assumption that foreign aid and research programs were automatically beneficial. Communities across the continent had become more assertive about demanding transparency and genuine consent before participating in any medical or social programs. Ibrahim, now promoted to colonel and serving as Burkina Faso's Minister of Defense, had become a leading voice for what was being called the African Dignity Movement. The movement emphasized the need for Africa to take control of its own development, to become an equal partner rather than a passive recipient in international relationships. The lesson of Project Africa. Ibrahim said during a speech at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, is not that we should reject all international cooperation. It's that we must insist on genuine partnership based on mutual respect and transparency. We must never again allow others to decide what is best for us without our knowledge and consent. The Memorial Garden in Ouagadougou became a pilgrimage site for people from across Africa and around the world. Visitors came to pay their respects to the victims, to learn about the history of medical abuse, and to commit themselves to ensuring such atrocities would never be repeated. But the garden also served another purpose. It was a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. The earth itself had revealed the location of the facility when floods washed away the soil that had hidden it for decades, and once revealed, the truth had proven impossible to contain or suppress. Standing in the garden on the anniversary of the discovery, Ibrahim reflected on how much had changed, but also on how much work remained to be done. The active research sites had been shut down, but the underlying attitudes that had made Project Africa possible, the view of Africans as subjects rather than partners, the willingness to sacrifice African lives for claimed benefits, those attitudes were harder to change. Kofi joined him in the garden, moving slowly but steadily with the aid of a walking stick. Despite everything he had endured, the old teacher had retained his fundamental optimism about human nature and his belief in the possibility of genuine progress. "Do you think we've really changed things?" Ibrahim asked him. "Or will they just find new ways to hide their exploitation?" Kofi was quiet for a moment, looking at the monuments that bore witness to so much suffering. "The young people who come here," he said finally, "they're different from previous generations. They ask questions, they demand answers, they refuse to accept things simply because an authority figure tells them to. That's what will prevent this from happening again. Not laws or treaties, but an informed population that won't be deceived." Ibrahim nodded, understanding the truth of what Kofi was saying. The real legacy of their discovery wasn't just the prosecution of war criminals or the establishment of new oversight mechanisms. It was the awakening of consciousness, the recognition that dignity and respect were not privileges to be granted by others, but rights to be claimed and defended. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the memorial garden, Ibrahim made a silent promise to the victims whose names were carved in stone, and to the countless others whose suffering might never be fully acknowledged. The truth they had died for would be protected. The lessons learned from their sacrifice would not be forgotten, and their memory would serve as a shield against those who would treat human beings as experimental subjects. The earth had kept their secrets for too long, but now those secrets were exposed to the light, and in that light, a new chapter of African history was being written, one based on dignity, truth, and the unshakable conviction that every human life has value that cannot be measured in research data or experimental results. The buried truth had been unearthed, and with it, the possibility of a future built on justice rather than exploitation, on partnership rather than domination, on the recognition that Africa's greatest resource was not its minerals or its land, but its people who deserved to be treated with the full respect and dignity that was their birthright. As Ibrahim walked away from the memorial garden, he carried with him the weight of responsibility that came with knowledge, but also the hope that came from truth revealed. The darkness had been exposed to light, and in that light, healing could begin. The Bay.